This is a production of Cornell University.
Good evening and welcome to the third of the summer lecture series. Walter Starr is truly bicoastal. Born in Massachusetts, he grew up in California. He counts his alma maters the East Coast Phillips Exeter Academy, the West Coast Stanford University, and the East Coast Harvard Law School and Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He graduated from each with honors. At Stanford, and I'm telling you this because we don't think of historians as doing things like this necessarily. He studied political science and history, and his senior thesis involved a computer model of organizational decisions. His master's in public policy thesis at the Kennedy School was about agricultural marketing orders. And while a student there, he was a teaching assistant in a mathematical methods course. After graduating from Harvard, Walter joined the Washington office of an international law firm that eventually posted him to Hong Kong, where he worked for 3 years. In 1990, he joined the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, working for several years in the chairman's office. In 1995, Fidelity Investments hired him to be their first international lawyer based in Hong Kong, and his work took him throughout Asia. Walter returned to Washington in 1999, joining Emerging Markets Partnership as an international lawyer, focusing on Asia, eventually rising to be general counsel of EMP Global, as the firm is known today. He's now largely retired from legal work and concentrates on research and writing. Walter's first book, John Jay, Founding Father, was published in 2005. His second, Seward, Lincoln's Indispensable Man, was published in 2012. It had the distinction of being the first new Seward biography in more than 40 years. He's presently working on a biography of Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton that's scheduled to be published in 2016. His wife, Dr. Masami Starr, is a mathematics teacher at Phillips Exeter. He and his family divide their time between Exeter and Newport Beach, where they have a second home. Although he has no formal role at Exeter, he has an important informal one as advisor of the mock trial team. In February 2012, the team won the New Hampshire State Championship, a feat they repeated in February of this year. He's extremely proud of them. Walter Starr, William H. Seward, Abraham Lincoln's indispensable man.
Thank you, Bud, for that very kind introduction. Can you all hear me? Okay. I propose to talk tonight about Seward and his life, and especially, since I'm here in upstate New York, his relations with his home state of New York. Seward is born in 1801 in what you all think of as down south, Orange County, New York. And grows up in the little town there of Florida. His father is kind of the principal man of the town. He's a merchant, he's a judge, he's a politician, he's the postmaster. And Seward grows up with politics around the dinner table. He's a bright boy, and he goes off to school, first to an academy in the nearby town of Goshen, and then to Union College in Schenectady. And years later, writing his memoir, he wrote about how impressed he was by the steamboat trip up the Hudson River and his first sight of Albany. He wrote that no city that he had ever seen in his life, not Paris, not Constantinople, not Benares, made the impression upon him that Albany did when he first saw it as a young man. From Albany, he takes the stagecoach over to Schenectady, and as he wrote in his memoir, he mounted the hill, not anywhere near the size of hill that you all have here, but the hill that goes up to Union College with some trepidation because he wasn't sure he was going to pass the entrance exam. But he did pass it with flying colors, entering the sophomore class. Union College was then one of the leading schools of the nation. Within a year or so of Seward's arrival, it acquires the 4th chapter of Phi Beta Kappa in the country. And Seward, upon learning that there would be such a distinction, immediately sets to work to become a member of Phi Beta Kappa, which he does. He almost doesn't graduate from college. Like many college students before and since, he and his parents don't see quite eye to eye on the topic of money. My son and I sometimes have some issues on this. And midway through what should have been his senior year of college, Seward, without notice to his father or the college, simply leaves. Gets on a boat, heads down to the then remote parts of Georgia. His parents figure out where he is, and they write him letters pleading with him to return. He's set up as a schoolmaster there, in fact, the principal of a new school in Putnam County, Georgia. But eventually yields to his mother's pleas, returns to New York State, returns to school, graduates. Upon graduation, he sets out to become a lawyer. And as one did in those days, there were no law schools, he read law. He read law first in Goshen and then for a while in New York City. And he could, upon completing his legal studies, have settled in either of those places, but he doesn't. Instead, he settles in Auburn, 35, 40 miles up the road from you here. Why Auburn? It's a little bit of a mystery. In his memoir, he writes that he had received a sum of money that would enable him to explore the western part of the state. But he only mentions one town that he explored, Auburn. Now, he does mention elsewhere in the memoir that he knew someone in Auburn. He knew Frances Miller, the daughter, chuckle, chuckle, he knew the daughter of Judge Miller, a prominent lawyer in town. And so that may well explain why he at least stopped in Auburn. But Seward and Frances were not romantically involved when he first arrived in Auburn. In fact, his letters from that period, which I found in the Historical Society there, indicate that he was much more interested in a young woman in the next town over, Skaneateles or Skineateles. Letters, by the by, not printed in Seward's memoir. So why Auburn? Well, late in life, a young man approached Seward and said, "Where should I settle?" And Seward wrote him back a letter that said he believed that a young man should get his start not in the big cities, but in a small town, and preferably in the county seat in a new county. Well, that almost exactly describes Auburn when Seward settled there himself in the 1820s. It's the county seat of Cayuga County, which is at the time a fairly new county, only 20 years old. It's not a huge place, but it has factories making furniture and rope, and it has the prison, which it still has. And so there's a lot for a young lawyer to do. It's a great place for him to get his start in life. He settles there, joins Judge Miller's law firm as his junior partner, and soon is arguing his cases not just in Cayuga County, but in all the surrounding counties. I'm reasonably sure that he's down here in Ithaca at some point within a few years of settling up there. I had initially intended in writing this section of the book to sort of have one section that talked about his legal career and then a second section that talked about his political career. But I realized the more I got into it that his political career started the day he got to town. In fact, it started when he was in college. While he was in college, I should mention this being here in Tompkins County, Daniel Tompkins, at the time the Vice President of the United States, comes to visit Union College, and Seward is selected to give the address of welcome, in part because he's a good speaker, but in part because he's already known as a political kid, the leader of the Tompkins for Governor group on campus, I surmise. So from the day he gets to Auburn, he's involved in the local militia, and he's a member of the vestry of the local church, and he's writing newspaper articles for candidates, And he writes one newspaper article anonymously to oppose the Presbyterian effort to impose blue laws. So his political career starts long before he holds office. He's active in 1824 in the campaign of the local bit of the campaign of John Quincy Adams. He's active in 1828, again in the campaign. And in 1830, he's nominated to serve as the anti-Masonic senator for a Senate district that includes 6 counties, Cayuga and basically most of the rest of the Finger Lakes. Not down here to Tompkins County, that's a different district, but sort of, you can think of most of what's just north of you here. And he's a well-suited candidate because he's not just an anti-Mason, a group of people opposing the political power of the Masonic Party, but he's known as an Adams man, a man in favor of internal improvements. He carries the district, and in 1830 goes off to Albany as state senator. His wife stays home. Indeed, talking at dinner, I realized that that's sort of a consistent theme throughout his political life, that his wife stays home. She stays home. She has reasons to stay home. They have 2 small children at the time that he's elected to the state senate. Her father is still alive. They live in the same house with her father and her maiden aunt sister. But she has reasons not just of attraction to attraction to Auburn, but also repulsion to Albany and then later repulsion from Washington. She just does not like politics and politicians, and especially perhaps politicians' wives. Skipping forward to the Civil War era, when Seward finally gets her down to Washington, she feels that she has to pay a call upon Mary Lincoln. And so Seward lets Lincoln know that he and his wife and the family will be coming to the White House to pay a call upon Mary Lincoln. And they arrive en masse because it's not just Seward and wife, but it's Seward's 2 sons and daughter-in-law and daughter, and big group of Sewards arrive, sit down, hand in their visiting cards as one did in those days, and the usher tells them, wait just a moment. And they wait and they wait, and then as Fanny describes it, Fanny being Seward's young daughter, describes it in her diary, the usher comes back and says, so sorry, Mrs. Lincoln is not receiving. To which Fanny says in her diary, baloney. If she really wasn't receiving, they would have turned us away at the door. She didn't want to see us. And Frances, the wife, just hated that kind of visiting and calling. And so she, by and large, just stays at home during Seward's 4 years as state senator, his 4 years as governor of New York, his 12 years as federal senator, and then 8 years as secretary of state. A long period away from upstate New York, away from home. Briefly, what is he? As state senator, I can't say that he accomplishes much. He goes back home to Auburn for a while, practices law. In 1838, he's elected governor of New York. What does he do as governor? What are his claims to fame as your governor? I should mention that it's not well known that he was governor. When I was over in Albany doing research at the library, one of the research people asked me what I was doing. I said, I'm researching Governor Seward. And she said, oh, well, he was never governor. I guess the point is you really need to leave a large building or something, a bridge or something here in New York so people know that you were governor. Seward as governor set out a very ambitious agenda. He wanted to build not merely 1, but 3 railroads, kind of east-west across the state. He wanted to widen the Erie Canal. He wanted to improve education. He wanted to reform the civil service system. And he accomplished some of that. The Erie Canal widening starts during his tenure. The work on the railroads starts during his tenure. I think the thing he would be proudest of, though, was the education reforms. At the time, there were large numbers of children who weren't going to school at all, particularly urban children and particularly the children of immigrants. There was a flood of immigrants coming from primarily Ireland, and the, quote, public schools of New York City were not educating these people because those schools were using the King James Bible and other Protestant texts. So they were not acceptable to Catholic parents. And the handful of Catholic schools were simply overwhelmed and unable to deal with the flood of students. Seward saw this as a huge problem, not just because he was sympathetic to the plight of these children, but because he saw these children, he saw immigrants in general, as a resource for the state, for the nation. And he felt that their education was important, not just for their own lives, but to make the state and the nation a greater place. And so he, from his very first inaugural address right through the 4 years of his governorship, worked on this cause. He was a Whig. This was not a Whig cause. By and large, the Whigs, perhaps a little like Republicans today, were not a party of immigrants or for immigrants. They were the party of those who'd been around for a while. And so Seward had to kind of engage in what we would call bipartisanship, reach across the aisle to Democrats, work with his good friend, Archbishop John Hughes, to find the votes to pass the legislation, the Maclay bill, which finally passes in the last year of his governorship. He doesn't run for a third term. He could, under the laws of the time, have done so, but he's run up a lot of debt entertaining, and he's tired of quarreling with the Whigs on this and that issue, so he again goes back to Auburn. He never leaves politics for a single day. I mean, he's home in Auburn within a few days. He's writing to his friend Thurlow Weed, the newspaper editor in Albany, both asking for the news and telling him about the political situation in Auburn. So he's out on the campaign trail in 1844 and again in 1848. And it's in 1848 at a campaign event in Boston, Massachusetts, that he first meets a man for whom he will become the indispensable man, Abraham Lincoln. Seward is the lead speaker, speaks for a considerable length of time that evening, and Lincoln is sort of the cleanup hitter at the end, speaking, as one newspaper put it, in a humorous Western strain to them in favor of Zachary Taylor for president. Now, those of you who know everything there is to know about Abraham Lincoln, and I'm sure that there are one or two of you out here, know that on the next night, that the two of them shared a hotel room and stayed up late talking about slavery. And I was very keen to nail down the details of this, of course, their first meeting, and so I researched this. Well, unfortunately, the story is that they shared a hotel room in Worcester, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, Seward was not in Worcester, Massachusetts on the next night. He was in Springfield, Massachusetts, giving a speech to a large audience of enthusiastic Whigs. And Lincoln, as best one can tell from the surviving newspapers, was on a train headed home to Springfield, Illinois. So how did this story, which is part of the accepted Lincoln lore, come to pass? It's in an account that Francis Carpenter, who's from this part of the world, wrote after Lincoln's death, during Seward's retirement, that Seward told him this story. Did Seward actually tell him this story and misremember himself? Did Carpenter hear it incorrectly? I don't know. All I know is that although they meet on the stage in Boston, that Lincoln and Seward do not share a hotel room in Worcester. In fact, they don't see one another from 1848 through the election of 1860. So let me cover that period briefly. Seward, by the election of 1848, is New York's leading Whig, the leading voice against the expansion of slavery in New York. And in the spring of 1849, the New York legislature, dominated by the Whigs that spring, elects Seward as New York's federal senator and sends him down to Washington. He arrives in time to be part of the brief presidency of Zachary Taylor. He arrives in time to be a Senate colleague of Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Calhoun, Jefferson Davis. His most famous speech is given a year later in opposition to what we know as the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 arises out of the application of California to become a state, and the Southern resistance to simply making California a free state, the Southern insistence that there be some quid pro quo if the South was going to allow another free state to come into the Union. Seward speaks against everything but the admission of California. As far as he's concerned, all of the other bits of the compromise are a mistake. The proposed strengthening of the fugitive slave law, the proposed measures to mollify the South. In his view, it is so important to bring California into the Union immediately that he says in one part of the speech that he would bring California in as a slave state if that is what the people of California indeed wanted. Now that bit of the speech, this is a long speech, 3 hours, is quite inconsistent with another bit of the speech later on in which he describes the Western Territory as having been dedicated by God to purposes higher than slavery, and that there is a higher law than the Constitution which dedicates the Western Territories to freedom. And just as in our own day, long speeches are boiled down into sound bites, the speech is soon boiled down into 2 words, higher law. Indeed, higher law becomes kind of a catchphrase for Seward and Seward's politics. Seward loses on the Compromise of 1850. As every school child knows, the Compromise passes. He loses on the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Indeed, if you look at his Senate career, it's something of a 12-year failure. He basically loses on the major issues that he cares about. And yet, we tend, I think, to focus too much on slavery and the sectional tension as we look at the 1850s and forget some of the other issues that people cared about. People here in New York cared about. So, for example, Seward was a firm advocate of a transcontinental railroad. And he viewed the disputes about the route as really sort of petty squabbles. In his mind, whatever the routing of the railroad, the de facto eastern end of the railroad would be New York City. Similarly, he supported subsidies for the Collins steamship line, which was a New York answer to the British steamship lines. He supported, indeed, was the kind of floor manager for the bill to build the transatlantic telegraph. Again, a measure that was going to heighten the importance of New York as one end of the New York-London financial pairing. The telegraph actually works briefly before the Civil War, before failing, and Seward, as Secretary of State, has to make do with other means of communication, letters and boats, rather than the telegraph. By 1860, as the run-up to that presidential election, Seward is once again a leading candidate. This time, he's the leading candidate for the Republican nomination for president. And if there had been betting on presidential candidates in 1860, he would have been kind of the odds-on favorite, 85% perhaps, likelihood of Seward's nomination, single digits for these other characters like Chase and Lincoln. But as we all know, in May of 1860, the Republican convention in Chicago nominates Lincoln, not Seward. Why? Why this, unsuccessful, one-term, unknown congressman from Illinois? Why not the successful governor and then senator of New York State? There are a lot of reasons, but at least one, and if I had to name one, only one, I would say the most important comes back to those Catholic school children in New York City. People didn't forget that Seward had been a friend of the immigrants, and many Republicans in 1860 were if not anti-immigrant, at least not very friendly to immigrants. One whom some of you may remember from the Lincoln movie, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, you remember? Yeah. He said that Pennsylvania would never vote for a man who ruined the common school system of New York City to curry the favor of immigrants. He was very admirable on some issues later, but on some other issues, not so. And even those in Chicago who were not themselves prejudiced against immigrants had to listen when leaders like Stevens said, look, you nominate Seward, you're going to lose Pennsylvania. Or the candidate for governor of Indiana said, look, you nominate Seward, you're going to lose Indiana. And the Republicans needed all of these states if they were going to win the presidency, not merely nominate a candidate. So, not for the first time, not for the last time in American history, the delegates at a presidential convention went for a candidate who had a little thinner record and thus could be sort of all things to all people, in that case, Abraham Lincoln. Seward is in his garden in Auburn. Candidates didn't go to conventions in those days. He's in his garden in Auburn when he learns that he's not going to get the nomination. And he actually sort of learns it even before he gets the telegram because the man running from the office sort of runs towards Seward saying, oh God, it's all gone. Abraham Lincoln has been nominated. And he was disappointed. There's no question that he was disappointed. There's a story, I think apocryphal, but there's a story that a year later when he was Secretary of State, someone told him that a candidate, a German-American candidate, would be disappointed if he didn't get a senior position in the State Department in Europe. And Seward reportedly said to this person, disappointment, you speak to me of disappointment. I, who was entitled to the Republican nomination and had to see it go to this unknown lawyer from Illinois. As I said, I don't think he really said that, but I have no doubt that he was as disappointed as that quotation makes him out to be. And one of the really great moments of his life is how he deals with that, because he doesn't simply sulk in Auburn or, as the New York Times predicted based on an interview with Seward in Auburn, serve out his remaining time in the U.S. Senate. He goes out on the campaign trail for Abraham Lincoln. Candidates, by and large, don't campaign for themselves at this time. So if Lincoln is going to become president, he needs good campaigners out there speaking for him, and nobody in 1860 was as good a campaigner as William Henry Seward. He campaigns all over the country, up into New England, out west to Minnesota, out to Kansas. I say all over the country, everywhere kind of north of the Mason-Dixon line, because there was really no point going down there. In those days, people voted by taking ballots. No one was even going to dare to hand out Republican ballots in places like Mississippi and South Carolina. And that's why when you see the presidential results for those years, you see Lincoln getting a 0 in the southern states. It's not that there weren't one or two people who might have voted for him down there. It's that there was no one who was brave enough to hand out a printed ballot for Lincoln down there. And coming back to New York State, he campaigns here in New York. In most of the other states, you have kind of 3 candidates against Lincoln. You have Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, and John Bell on the Constitutional Union platform, which was basically just, we'll stick to the Constitution and say nothing further. And in most states, those 3 kind of divide the vote, and so Lincoln, in a number of cases, is able to get the electoral votes of a state, even though he wins a minority of the votes. But here in New York, after an extended negotiation, and somebody really needs to write the story of this, a fusion party is formed, or a union party, so called because its adherents thought that the only way to preserve the union was to deny Abraham Lincoln the presidency. And indeed, one newspaper that I found not far from here in a tiny historical society said in announcing the formation of this fusion party that they could confidently on this day say that Abraham Lincoln would not be the president, because everyone could do the math. Without the electoral votes of New York State, Abraham Lincoln could not become president. There just was no way, with the southern states effectively off limits, without New York, he couldn't become president. So Seward, after this long Western tour, wants to rest, but he can't. He has to go out on the campaign trail again, and he does, first up here in upstate New York, then down in New York City, to try to ensure that the fusion ticket does not deny Lincoln the electoral votes of New York State. He succeeds, not by a lot, a few thousand votes here in New York, a few thousand votes elsewhere, and Abraham Lincoln would not have been president. But Seward and the others campaigning for Lincoln ensure that Lincoln wins here in New York, he wins in Pennsylvania, he wins in a sufficient number of northern states to become president. So when people ask me, well, why is Seward Lincoln's indispensable man? In a sense, his indispensability starts even before he gets to the State Department. It is in the election of 1860 and ensuring that Abraham Lincoln, rather than Stephen Douglas or someone else, becomes our president. During that secession winter, as the southern states leave, Seward is back in Washington as senator, as the widely reputed Secretary of State to be. And he is the leader during that winter of the forces in favor of compromise. It's curious. I mean, here's this man who has a reputation as a radical on the issue of slavery, higher law Seward, or as he said in Rochester in 1858, that there was an irrepressible conflict between the systems of slavery and freedom in the United States. But as the southern states secede, Seward is among those keenest to see if some form of compromise, like the Compromise of 1850, which he denounced so vigorously as a senator, can be cobbled together to hold the southern states in the Union. Or maybe not to hold all the southern states, but at least to hold the border states, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Missouri, these places which have not, as Lincoln is inaugurated, joined the Confederacy, that are sort of sitting poised, if you will, between the United States and the Confederate States. And Seward is very keen to try, by any possible means, to hold on to them. He believes that if war can just be avoided for a few months, that within the southern states themselves, a Union party will begin to form, and one by one, those states will begin to come back into the Union. And so he's in favor of compromise, not just up until the time he becomes Secretary of State. He's in favor of compromise even thereafter. And he and Lincoln, as President and Secretary of State, got off to a very rocky start, because Lincoln is nowhere near as keen on compromise as Seward right at this juncture. Lincoln is keen to live up to the promises that he made in his inaugural address, that he would hold and possess the places that belong to the United States, starting, he doesn't mention this in the inaugural address, but everyone understands that what he means principally is Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, one of the last bits of federal territory in the nascent Confederacy. Seward is in favor of giving it up. It's a sort of pointless flag in the middle of the harbor. It doesn't do any good, and he thinks that giving it up will help bring some of that Union sentiment out in the South. Lincoln overrules Seward, sends a mission to reinforce Fort Sumter with supplies. Seward predicts that that will lead to civil war, and indeed it does, as the South fires on that mission and the North erupts in a blaze of patriotic anger, and the South likewise erupts in a blaze of patriotic anger and volunteering. Second, Seward's kind of second indispensable role during the Civil War is as Secretary of State, in charge of our foreign relations. And you can read a lot of histories of the Civil War and not learn a lot about our foreign relations. And in a sense, that's sort of because Seward handles them so well. If we had gotten ourselves into a war with Britain or France during the course of the Civil War, if that had distracted our attention from the Civil War, well, that would form a large part of the history of the Civil War. Seward's job was to prevent that. Perhaps the most dramatic moment at which he prevents that is the Trent crisis in late 1861. The Trent was a British merchant ship. It was stopped by an aggressive Union naval commander, Wilkes, who had heard a rumor that there were some Confederate diplomats on board. There were. He arrested two people who were, two men, Mason and Slidell, who were on their way to be the Confederate ministers to Britain and France. He arrested them, put them on the Union ship, brought them, he headed first for New York. Seward diverted him to Boston. When news of these reached the United States, there was jubilation. Wilkes was hailed as a hero. There was a motion in Congress to cast a gold medal. And people said, you know, this is wonderful. What a coup. We're never giving up these men. When news reached Britain, there was almost an equally adverse reaction. This was an insult to the British flag, a violation of Britain's neutrality, and shortly before Christmas, 1861, Seward has the formal demand from Britain. Give up the four men, the two diplomats and their secretaries, and apologize or else. Seward, by the time that formal demand has arrived, this takes a long time. Again, there's no telegraph, so everything, you know, goes by ship back and forth across the Atlantic. He has more or less resolved that he's going to give them up. He doesn't, again, it's a little bit like Fort Sumter. He doesn't see them as being that valuable in themselves. But Lincoln is far from there. Indeed, we have in the Lincoln papers Lincoln's draft of Seward's response to the British minister in Washington. And it's a long, legalistic document. Basically, Lincoln suggests that Seward should propose arbitration, that the issues, the legal and factual issues in the dispute should be resolved by some neutral international arbitration. Well, Seward's a lawyer, as is Lincoln, and Seward knows that the British are just going to view that as a legalistic evasion, sort of trying to delay matters for a year or two while holding on to the diplomats. It's not going to work. And Seward brings Lincoln around and brings the cabinet around during a course of 2 all-day meetings on Christmas Day and the day thereafter, and then brings the public around with a very cleverly worded response to the British minister, which Seward immediately publishes in the newspapers so that it reaches the American public long before it reaches London, analogizing the situation with the War of 1812 and saying that he, Seward, could not hold on to the diplomats without disregarding the diplomatic principles of Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, so sort of wrapping himself in the American flag, while at the same time handing over the 4 contested prisoners to the British as they demanded, and thereby avoiding what would have been, from the American perspective, or maybe I should say from the Northern perspective, a disastrous war with Britain. If we had gone, in my view, if we had gone to war with Britain during the course of the Civil War, the Confederacy, in some form, would have survived the Civil War. So that's maybe Seward's kind of second indispensability. But Seward did not limit himself to foreign policy. He didn't just sort of sit in Foggy Bottom and, you know, write letters. He was, in effect, Lincoln's deputy president. So just 2 other ways in which he does this. During the first year of the war, Seward handles what we would call internal security, arresting suspected spies. Again, I think the story is apocryphal, but it captures him. He reportedly tells Lord Lyons, the British minister, that he has a little bell on his desk and that he can, by ringing his little bell, order the capture of any man and woman in America, and that nobody other than the president could order their release. And then he says, "Can even Queen Victoria say as much?" Again, I'm 99% sure that story is apocryphal. It first appears, this is one reason it's nice to be doing research in the 21st century. I can do computerized research. The first place that story appears is in opposition newspapers in 1863, arguing that Lincoln and Seward have disregarded the Constitution, sort of thrown people in jail without allowing them the chance to appeal. But again, it captures his feeling at the time, which was that there were dangerous people who needed to be arrested, and he was going to arrest them, and he wasn't going to worry too much about the fine print of the Constitution. That is roughly Seward's approach to domestic security during the first year of the war. He handles not only that, he handles politics for Lincoln. And so in the election of 1864, for example, Lincoln gives no campaign speeches. But Seward does give campaign speeches. He comes up here to New York to visit his family in Auburn and gives a couple of pretty stern campaign speeches in which he analogizes the Democratic Party in the North, which was running on a peace platform, with what he called the Democrats in Richmond, i.e. the Confederates, and said that really, if you vote for McClellan, the Democratic candidate, you're effectively voting for Jefferson Davis because they want the same thing. They want an armistice and an end to the war. Pretty harsh rhetoric. Lincoln would never have engaged in it, but an important message that Seward conveys for Lincoln. Or to take another example with which many of you are probably familiar, the 13th Amendment. In January of 1865, after the election, Lincoln and Seward decide that they're going to make a big push to get the House of Representatives to pass what we call the 13th Amendment. It was not, by the by, called the 13th Amendment at the time because no one knew. Would it be the 13th Amendment? Would it be the 14th? It would depend on sort of what happened in the future. It was called at the time the Anti-Slavery Amendment. To whom does Lincoln turn to get the votes in the House of Representatives? To his political operatives in the White House, or maybe to a close friend in the House of Representatives? No. He turns to his Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, and William Henry Seward, in turn, hires a bunch of shady New York lobbyists. Many of the votes that need to be gotten are from New York Democrats. And Seward knows the people who know those people, and he hires those lobbyists. And as depicted in the movie, there are substantial indications that money is involved. One bit they excluded from the movie, I wish they had included. One of the lobbyists goes up to New York, and he writes to Seward, "Don't worry, I'm sure the amendment will pass the House. If patriotism is not sufficient, money will surely do the trick." And as depicted in the movie, the amendment does pass the House of Representatives and is sent by, out to the states to be ratified. One thing I wish the movie had emphasized, it was urgent. They didn't know it at the time, but Lincoln only had another 3 months to live. If that amendment had not passed the House of Representatives in January of 1865, with Lincoln and Seward twisting arms to get it through, Andrew Johnson, when he became president, was not going to twist any arms to pass an amendment to end slavery. Indeed, he resists mightily the 14th and 15th Amendment, he being President Andrew Johnson. Seward and Lincoln hoped to see the end of the war in 1865 and to see, as Seward had hoped before the war, to see the Union come back together. Lincoln tragically doesn't live to see that. Many people forget that Seward almost didn't live to see it either. On the night of the assassination, Booth and the other assassins targeted not only Lincoln, but Vice President Johnson, General Grant, and Seward. Why Seward? Some scholars have written that Seward was targeted because of a statute at the time which charged the Secretary of State with organizing elections in the event of the death of both the president and the vice president, to which I say roughly nonsense. Booth was not a lawyer. He was an actor, a Shakespearean actor, and he wanted to kill the man whom he viewed as the tyrant, Lincoln, but also the deputy tyrant, Seward, the deputy president. He wanted to have a different ending for his version of the play Julius Caesar. And the assassins nearly do kill Seward. He's in his sickbed, confined by wounds, and an assassin bursts into his sick room with a pistol in one hand. The pistol isn't working. A Bowie knife in the other. I've seen the Bowie knife. It's in the Huntington in California. It is a fearsome weapon in the hands of a huge, tall Confederate veteran. He presses Seward into the bed with one hand and with the other slashes down in sort of a theatrical motion. He fails. It's not clear why, whether it's the brace on Seward's head to protect his jaw, whether it's because Seward rolls, or whether it's because of the screams of Seward's daughter, Fanny. He's wrestled off of Seward by Seward's son and an army sergeant, and Seward is left sort of with these terrible cuts around his face and neck, but fortunately, none of the main arteries are severed, and he survives. He survives, and he remains our Secretary of State through the controversial presidency of Andrew Johnson, and it's during that period that he purchases Alaska. And I think the one thing that almost everyone knows, I mean, when I would tell taxi drivers what I was working on, they would say, "Oh, Seward's Folly." People know that when the purchase of Alaska, which was at the time called Russian America, was announced, that people laughed. They called it Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox, and they joked about the walruses on the icebergs. Well, I've read a lot of newspapers from the period right after the treaty was announced, and I'm here to tell you that they didn't call it Seward's Folly. Almost all of the newspaper coverage was favorable. They thought it was a good idea to acquire all of this territory with the timber and the minerals. They thought it was a good idea to have a bridge to Asia, which was becoming more important. They thought it was a good idea to kind of acquire Alaska and thus strengthen our potential claims on British Columbia. They thought it was a good idea to strengthen our relations with Russia, which was a major ally of the United States during the Civil War. Yes, it's true that one newspaper, the New York Tribune, said that there was, I think the phrase was that no treaty that we can remember has embraced so much folly. But that was the closest I could get to Seward's Folly. And I think the sort of nail in the coffin is that the Senate ratified the treaty within a couple weeks after it was presented by a vote of 37-2. Senators don't vote for things that are viewed as folly by a vote of 37-2. So Seward happily, almost gleefully, acquires Alaska, and he hopes to acquire a lot of other places. He hopes to acquire British Columbia. He hopes to acquire Hawaii. He actually signs a treaty with Columbia to acquire the rights to build the Panama Canal. He has, in short, a vision of empire, which doesn't come to pass during his lifetime, doesn't even come to pass during the 19th century, but ultimately becomes roughly the American empire. And so I think, you know, were he to return today and see that, you know, New York is the center of international finance, and that Washington is the headquarters of the World Bank, and that we have not merely Alaska, but Hawaii, and that we built the Panama Canal. And here in Cornell, you know, that we have achieved, if not what he said in one speech. He said in one speech that the United States, the American empire will not be truly great until we have not only expanded our territory and built our economy, but produced a Milton and a Shakespeare. Well, we haven't perhaps produced a Milton and a Shakespeare, But we have some incredibly fine universities. I think if Seward could come back and see all this, that he would be tremendously proud of what we have accomplished and of his small role in those accomplishments. So, thanks. I will take some questions. So the question, if I got it right, was how did the Civil War itself influence later territorial expansion by the United States? Some of the territorial expansion that occurred was kind of in the works before the Civil War, and the Civil War puts a kind of stopper on it. So there had been some very preliminary discussions about Russian America before the Civil War. Basically, nothing happens during the Civil War, but after the war, Seward restarts those. But there's some other instances in which the Civil War itself points out to Seward and other like-minded people the need of other territory. So, for example, the Caribbean was a real source of weakness to the United States and strength to the Confederates. The Caribbean served kind of as the base for a lot of the blockade runners, and Seward in his letters talked about how important it would be to acquire a naval base in the Caribbean. And so really the first bit of territory that he sets out to acquire right after the Civil War is a naval base. And he works all the way through his time, and it continues into the Grant administration, efforts to acquire either a bay or an island or a set of islands. And again, he signs a treaty. He signs a treaty with Denmark to acquire what we call the Virgin Islands for a very modest price. The treaty is not ratified, and then 40 years later, the United States winds up acquiring the very same islands for, I don't know, 4 or 5 times the price. So, and similarly, the Panama Canal, another problem for the United States during the Civil War was that it had no means of communication with California and Oregon, between those two bits. And the railroad was part of the answer, but Seward saw the canal as another important part of what was going to link the East Coast with the West Coast. So again, his experiences during the war, I think, help sort of focus his attention on the fact that a merely continental empire is not sufficient, that you need to have some other little bits and pieces to accomplish what, in his mind, the United States should ultimately accomplish. Union College, when he attended it, was, unlike a lot of other schools, it wasn't associated with any one denomination, but it was headed by a Presbyterian minister and had definitely sort of a religious cast, and that was agreeable to Seward. I mean, he grows up in Presbyterian and becomes Episcopalian. He's not a very denominational Christian. He's not maybe the most attentive in going to church. There's a great story during the war, actually sort of early before the war starts, when on Easter Sunday morning, 1861, he summons a military aide and says, "Go get me so-and-so." And he says, "Well, I'll do it after church." And he says, "Blank, to church this morning, go get me so-and-so." He has, of the two senators, he knows both Andrew Johnson and Jefferson Davis as senators. Of the two, he's actually much closer with Jefferson Davis. There's some really quite touching stories. Davis had eye disease, and at one point is confined to his room for several weeks, and there's some question about whether he'll lose his sight. Seward comes every day to visit his friend Jefferson Davis, just to tell stories, just to talk about what's going on in the Senate, what's going on in Washington, to gossip. And at one point tells Davis's wife that, in tears, that he hopes and prays that Davis will not lose his sight. He's such a fine specimen of manhood that it would be a tragedy if he lost his sight. He's not particularly close with Andrew Johnson, and remember that Johnson is not vice president for most of the war. Hannibal Hamlin of Maine is vice president up to the election of 1864, And vice presidents in those days were not what they are today. They were not included in the cabinet. There was not much dealing with the vice president. So Seward really had very little to do with either Hamlin as vice president or Johnson as vice president until Johnson becomes president. Did the fact that Quincy Adams was our ambassador to Russia have any influence on Seward's interest in Russian America? I love doing these events because I do get questions that I have never thought about. I think the answer is yes, in sort of two respects. One is that Seward idolized John Quincy Adams. He met him first as a young man, and then had a connection kind of with three generations of the Adams family. John Quincy Adams, our sixth president, Charles Francis Adams, who serves for 8 years as Seward's minister to the Court of St. James in London, and then the next generation, Henry Adams and Charles Francis Adams Jr. are younger men, but sort of proteges of Seward's. But the Adams family and that strong relationship between the United States and Russia, I think, is part of why Seward is interested in Russian America, because he doesn't want it to become a source of conflict. Both the Americans and the Russians, as they look at Russian American, have very much the history of Texas on their mind. Here Texas was part of Mexico, and then these American settlers start showing up, and then there starts to be tension, and then, for heaven's sake, they declare themselves an independent nation. The Russians didn't want that to happen in Russian America, and Seward didn't want it to happen either. He wanted, if Russian America was going to become part of the United States, and he thought it made sense for it to do so, he wanted it to happen in a friendly way, through a negotiation rather than through a conflict and a war. I'm glad you asked that question. One of the things that led me to be sure that I had to write a new biography of Seward was that the prior biography didn't even mention Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman lives, as most of you know, in Auburn, but you may not know that Seward is her landlord up in Auburn. And I think Seward is the Seward family, not just Seward but his wife, are a major reason that she decides to settle there in Auburn, because it's a friendly place for someone who, in essence, has a price on her head. He's a landlord, but a very gracious landlord. He doesn't charge much rent, and when she doesn't pay the rent, he doesn't chase her for the rent. And he does help her after the war in getting a federal job. You touch on the question he asked about, he mentioned in the question Tubman's sort of activities in encouraging revolts and John Brown. That's an interesting question that I don't completely know the answer to. I know that she knew quite a bit about what John Brown was going to do, but I don't know how much she and others told Seward about what John Brown intended to do. And of course, with John Brown, it's hard to know, even if somebody had a complete description of what he was intending on one day, how closely that would relate to what he ultimately did. But it's an interesting question, what, if anything, Seward knew ahead of John Brown's raid about Brown's plans. So the question was Seward lives for many years of his life in his father-in-law's house, Judge Miller's house in Auburn. Was there awkwardness? Was that difficult? We don't have all the family letters from that period. But I'm reasonably sure that it was somewhat difficult for Seward to live there with Judge Miller. But there were, from his perspective, advantages as well. His wife didn't particularly like to travel. As I mentioned, she hated Albany. She hated Washington. And so by leaving his wife, Frances, there in the household, which was headed by Judge Miller until Miller dies, I think, something like 1855, he's leaving her basically in her home. He's not uprooting her and forcing her to come with him, which would have made it difficult for him to travel as much as he needed to for business and wanted to for pleasure. So I'm sure that it was somewhat awkward, particularly in the early years of his married life, for him to be living there in the household headed by Judge Miller, but he did. The governor of New York, Governor William Henry Seward, when he was home in Auburn, lived in the Miller house, Judge Miller's house. The question was, how would Seward approach immigration policy now? And often when I get these questions about, transplant Seward to the present, it's hard to answer. I don't know about a lot of things, but I do know how he would view immigration today. He would say, bring him in. He was always in favor of bringing people to this country, not just as governor of New York. Remember, at that time, there was really no federal immigration policy. Each state had its own policies, and he saw immigrants as a source of strength to New York State at a time when many people disagreed. But also, as our Secretary of State, he pushed for, over the opposition of some people in the cabinet and in the Congress, immigration legislation to make it easier for immigrants to come to the United States. And then he bragged in his annual message about how many immigrants were coming to the United States in 1864 and 1865 and 1866, again, seeing these immigrants as a source of strength to the United States. So of course, they didn't have to deal with the conundrum that we face today of sort of how do you sort of bring people into a social safety net, but he would have been at the far sort of most liberal extreme of the Republican Party in terms of immigration. Bring them into the United States. Right, he's for the education of the immigrant children as well. And that continues again into the Lincoln administration. I don't have a letter from him in favor of the land-grant college bill, but he votes for it as a senator before it's vetoed by Buchanan in 1859, so I'm 99% sure that he's in favor of the land-grant college bill, the bill which ultimately leads to what we see here today at Cornell. Talk about Seward trying to turn down the post of Secretary of State. In the spring of 1861, Seward kind of first accepts and then tries to back away from being Secretary of State. The context is that Lincoln has arrived in Washington. He's shared with Seward a first draft of his inaugural address, and Seward is roughly horrified. Lincoln's tone in this inaugural address, in Seward's view, is bellicose. It threatens war with the South. It sort of waves the saber. And Seward gives Lincoln, being a careful lawyer, he numbers every line of Lincoln's printed address, and he gives him comments on every line almost. And at the very end, he gives him a rough draft of what becomes that famous closing. We are not enemies, we must not be enemies, we are friends, the mystic chords of memory. The first draft of that is Seward's. He gives him all this, and then, as best one can tell, there's a silence. Lincoln doesn't tell him what he's going to do in the inaugural address. And Seward grows more and more worried, and finally, on the eve of the inauguration, he sends Lincoln a letter saying that circumstances force me to withdraw my acceptance of the position of Secretary of State. Lincoln sends him back a letter saying, oh, please, please, I need you, the country needs you, I beg you to withdraw your letter withdrawing. And Seward thinks about it overnight, and I think he, in particular, thinks about the terrible situation the country is in, with 7 states having withdrawn and formed their own country, and all the foreign policy issues that is going to throw up. Indeed, it is already throwing up. And he meets with Lincoln, talks with him, and says, I'll do it. I'll be your Secretary of State. And so there is a moment, a day, if you will, when he has said to Lincoln, no, I won't do it. And And some authors see this as kind of a bluff. I don't. I see it more as an almost desperate attempt to ensure that the inaugural address has a conciliatory tone towards the South, which I think fairly read it does. It wasn't actually read that way by most Southerners, but maybe the most important people are in the border states, and it was read in Virginia and North Carolina by many as being conciliatory. Question was, how does Seward's attitude towards internal security echo forward into the future? It's not only Seward's attitude. I mean, this is, Lincoln and Stanton, the Secretary of War, they all have pretty similar attitudes during the Civil War. We would not today view them as being terribly careful about the constitutional safeguards for prisoners. And the legal precedents that are developed during the Civil War then become, when lawyers talk about these issues, the legal precedents that are developed during the Civil War ultimately become the precedents that are used today. So to some extent, if you want to, look for the antecedents of current approaches to these issues, you look back and you find Lincoln. We respect, we almost revere Lincoln to such an extent that we sometimes forget some of these slightly less savory bits of his record. But his civil rights or civil liberties record during the Civil War is not an especially good one. All right, I will hang about. I'm going to be out there, I believe, and signing books for either people who've already bought a book or wish to buy a book, but I will hang about and answer questions as long as there are people who wish to ask them. Thanks.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.